Chapter 3. The Deliverers of Their Country. It all began with Effie getting something in her eye. It hurt very much indeed, and it felt something like a red-hot spark, only it seemed to have legs as well, and wings like a fly. Effie rubbed and cried, not real crying, but the kind your eye does all by itself without you being miserable inside your mind. And then she went to her father to have the thing in her eye taken out. Effie's father was a doctor, so of course he knew how to take things out of eyes. He did it very cleverly, with a soft paintbrush dipped in castor oil. When he had gotten the thing out, he said, "This is very curious." Effie had often gotten things in her eye before, and her father had always seemed to think it was natural, rather tiresome and naughty perhaps, but still natural. He had never before thought it curious. Effie stood holding her handkerchief to her eye and said, "I don't believe it's out." People always say this when they have had something in their eye. "Oh, yes, it's out," said the doctor. "Here it is, on the brush. This is very interesting." Effie had never heard her father say that about anything that she had any share in. She said, "What?" The doctor carried the brush very carefully across the room and held the point of it under his microscope. Then he twisted the brass screws of the microscope and looked through the top with one eye. "Dear me," he said, "dear me. 4 well-developed limbs, a long caudal appendage, 5 toes on equal lengths, almost like one of the Lacertidae, and yet there are traces of wings." The creature under his eye wriggled a bit in the castor oil, and he went on. "Yes, a bat-like wing, a new specimen undoubtedly." Effie ran round to the professor and asked him to be kind enough to step in for a few minutes. "Well, you might give me 6 pence, Daddy," said Effie, "because I did bring you the new specimen. I took great care of it inside my eye, and my eye does hurt." The doctor was so pleased with the new specimen that he gave Effie a shilling, and presently the professor stepped round. He stayed to lunch, and he and the doctor quarreled very happily all afternoon about the name and the family of the thing that had come out of Effie's eye. But at tea time another thing happened. Effie's brother Harry fished something out of his tea, which he thought at first was just an earwig. He was getting ready to drop it on the floor and end its life in the usual unpleasant way, when it shook itself in the spoon, spread 2 wet wings, and flopped onto the tablecloth. There it sat, stroking itself with its feet, stretching its wings, and Harry said, "Why, it's a tiny newt." The professor leaned forward before the doctor could get a word in. "I'll give you half a crown for it, Harry, my lad," he said, speaking very fast. Then he picked it up carefully in his handkerchief. "It is a new specimen," he said, "and finer than yours, doctor." It was a tiny lizard, about half an inch long, with scales and wings. So now the doctor and the professor each had a specimen, and they were both very pleased. But before long these specimens began to seem less valuable, for the next morning, when the knife boy was cleaning the doctor's boots, he suddenly dropped the brushes and the boot and the blacking, and he screamed that he was burnt. And from inside the boot came crawling a lizard, as large as a kitten, with large shiny wings. "Why," said Effie, "I know what it is. It is a dragon, like the one St. George killed." And Effie was right. That afternoon, Towser was bitten in the garden by a dragon about the size of a rabbit, which he had tried to chase, and the next morning all the papers were full of the wonderful winged lizards that were appearing all over the country. The papers would not call them dragons, because, of course, no one believes in dragons nowadays, and at any rate the paper was not going to be so silly as to believe in fairy tales. At first there were only a few, but in a week or two the country was simply running alive with dragons of all sizes, and in the air you could sometimes see them as thick as a swarm of bees. They all looked alike, except as to size. They were green, with scales. They had 4 legs and a long tail, and great wings like bats' wings, only the wings were a pale, half-transparent yellow, like gearboxes on bicycles. They breathed fire and smoke, as all proper dragons must, but still the newspapers went on pretending they were lizards, until the editor of the Standard was picked up and carried away by a very large one, and then the other newspaper people had not anyone left to tell them what they ought not to believe. So, when the largest elephant in the zoo was carried off by a dragon, the papers gave up pretending, and they put "Alarming Plague of Dragons" at the top of the paper. You have no idea how alarming it was, and at the same time how aggravating. The large-sized dragons were terrible, certainly. But when once you found out that the dragons always went to bed early because they were afraid of the chill night air, you had only to stay indoor all day and you were pretty safe from the big ones. But the smaller sizes were a perfect nuisance. The ones as big as earwigs got into the soap, and they got in the butter. The ones as big as dogs got into the bath, and the fire and smoke inside of them made them steam like anything when the cold water tap was turned on, so careless people were often scalded quite severely. The ones that were as large as pigeons would get into work baskets or corner drawers and bite you when you were in a hurry to get a needle or a handkerchief. The ones as big as sheep were easier to avoid because you could see them coming, but when they flew in at the window and curled up under your eider-down quilt, and you did not find them until you went to bed, it was always a bit of a shock. The ones this size did not eat people, only lettuce, but they always scorched the sheets and the pillowcases something dreadful. Of course, the county council and the police did everything that could be done. It was no use offering the hand of the princess to anyone who killed a dragon. This was all very well in olden times, when there was only one dragon and one princess, but now there were far more dragons than there were princesses, although the royal family was a large one. And besides, it would have been a mere waste of princesses to offer rewards for killing dragons, because everybody killed as many dragons as they could, quite of their own accord, without any idea of reward, just to get rid of the nasty things. The county council undertook to cremate all dragons delivered to their office between the hours of 10 and 2, and whole wagon-loads and cart-loads and truck-loads of dead dragons could be seen any day of the week standing in a long line in the street where the county council had their office. Boys brought barrelfuls of dead dragons, and children on their way home from morning school would call in to leave the handful or two of little dragons they had brought in their satchels or carried in their knotted pocket handkerchiefs. And yet there seemed to be as many dragons as ever. Then the police put up great wood and canvas towers covered with patent glue. When the dragons flew against these towers, they stuck fast, as flies and wasps do on sticky papers in the kitchen, and when the towers were covered all over with dragons, the police inspector used to set fire to the towers and burnt them and the dragons and all. And yet there seemed to be more dragons than ever. The shops were full of patent dragon poison and anti-dragon soap and dragon-proof curtains for windows, and indeed everything and anything that could be done was done. And yet there seemed to be more dragons than ever.